The bombing of Guernica was an aerial attack on the Basque town of Guernica during the Spanish Civil War. It was carried out at the behest of the Spanish nationalist government by its allies, the German Air Force's Condor Legion and the Italian Aviation Legionaria, under the codename Operation Ruggin. The bombing is considered one of the first raids on a defenseless civilian population by a modern air force. The number of victims of the attack is still disputed. The Basque government reported 1,654 people killed, although modern figures suggest between 126 and 400 civilians died. Russian archives reveal 800 deaths on 1 May 1937, but this number may not include victims who later died of their injuries in hospitals or whose bodies were discovered buried in the rubble. The bombing was the subject of a famous anti-war painting by Pablo Picasso. It was also depicted in a woodcut by the German artist Heinz Kiewitz, who was later killed fighting in the international brigades. The bombing shocked and inspired many other artists, including a sculpture by René Iche Acute, one of the first electroacoustic music pieces by Patrick Achone, of a musical composition by René Louis Baron and poems by Paul Alouard and Uwais Krija. There is also a short film from 1950 by Alan Rees entitled Guernica, 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 in the Basque province of Biscay, and 30 kilometers east of Bilbao, has long been a center of great significance to the Basque people. Its Guernicaco arbela is an oak tree that symbolizes traditional freedoms for the Biscayan people and, by extension, for the Basque people as a whole. Not only was Guernica considered the identity of Basque, but it was also considered the spiritual capital of Basque people. Guernica has always been celebrated as the home of Basque liberties. Guernica was also the location of the Spanish weapons manufacturer Estancia Ycia, which had been a supplier of firearms to the Spanish military and police forces since 1912. At the time of the bombing, the population of Guernica was 7,000 people, and the battlefront was 30 kilometers away. Military situation advances by nationalist troops led by Generalissimo Francisco Franco had eaten into the territory controlled by the Republican government. The Basque government, an autonomous regional administrative body formed by Basque nationalists, sought to defend Biscay and parts of Gipuzkoa with its own light Basque army. At the time of the raid, Guernica represented a focal strategic point for the Republican forces. It stood between the nationalists and capture of Bilbao. Bilbao was seen as key to bringing the war to a conclusion in the north of Spain. Guernica also was the path of retreat for the Republicans from the northeast of Biscay. Prior to the Condor Legion raid, the town had not been directly involved in the fighting. Although Republican forces were in the area, 23 battalions of Basque army troops were at the front east of Guernica. The town also housed 2 Basque army battalions, although it had no static air defenses, and it was thought that no air cover could be expected due to recent losses of the Republican Air Force. Market Day Monday the 26th of April was Market Day. There were more than 10,000 people in the former Basque capital. Generally speaking, a market day would have attracted people from the surrounding areas to Guernica to conduct business. Market days consisted of local farmers bringing in their crops to sell to the village people. They would bring the crops of the week's labor to the main square, which is where the market was held. There is a historical debate over whether a market was being held that particular Monday. Prior to the bombing, the Basque government had ordered a general halt to markets to prevent blockage of roads, and restricted large meetings. It is accepted by most historians that Monday would have been a market day. Luftwaffe Doctrine, 1933-42. James Coram states that a prevalent view about the Luftwaffe and its blitzkrieg operations was that it had a doctrine of terror bombing, in which civilians were deliberately targeted in order to break the wall or aid the collapse of an enemy. After the bombing of Guernica in 1937 and of Rotterdam in 1940, it was commonly assumed that terror bombing was a part of Luftwaffe Doctrine. During the interwar period, the Luftwaffe leadership officially rejected the concept of terror bombing, and confined the air arms used to battlefield support of interdiction operations. The vital industries and transportation centers that would be targeted for shutdown were valid military targets. It could be claimed civilians were not to be targeted directly, but the breakdown of production would affect their morale and will to fight. German legal scholars of the 1930s carefully worked out guidelines for what type of bombing was permissible under international law, while direct attacks against civilians were ruled out as terror bombing. The concept of attacking vital war industries and probable heavy civilian casualties and breakdown of civilian morale was ruled as acceptable. General Walter Weaver compiled a doctrine known as the Conducts of the Aerial War in 1935. In this document, which the Luftwaffe adopted, the Luftwaffe rejected Giulio Douret's theory of terror bombing. Terror bombing was deemed to be counterproductive, increasing rather than destroying the enemy's will to resist. Such bombing campaigns were regarded as diversion from the Luftwaffe's main operations, destruction of the enemy armed forces. According to Coram, the bombings of Guernica, Rotterdam and Warsaw were tactical missions in support of military operations and were not intended as strategic terror attacks. The raid. The Condor Legion was entirely under the command of the Nationalist forces. The order to perform the raid was transmitted to the commanding officer of the Condor Legion, Oberstleutnant Wolfram Freyer von Richthofen, from the Spanish Nationalist Command. Mission planning. While questions are often raised over the intent of the raid, the diaries of the planner and commander of the mission, made public in the 1970s, indicate that an attack on Guernica represented part of the wider nationalist advance in the area and was also designed to support Franco's forces already in place. Richthofen, understanding the strategic importance of the town in the advance on Bilbao and restricting Republican retreat, ordered an attack against the roads and bridge in the Renteria suburb. Destruction of the bridge was considered the primary objective since the raid was to operate in conjunction with nationalist troop movements against Republicans around Marquina. Secondary objectives were restriction of Republican traffic, equipment movements and the prevention of bridge repair via the creation of rubble around the bridge. On the 22nd of March 1937, Franco started to put his plan into action, starting with his air chief, General Kundelin. The German army would first take the Guadalajara front. Italians then would be restructured at Palencia. From there, two new divisions were formed. General Emilio Mola would start the campaign against the Basques. All nationalist equipment was sent to the North Front to support Mola. The main reason to attack first from the north was the suspicion that it could be overthrown quickly. Mola wanted to make this fight quick. He let the Basque people know that if they wanted to surrender, he would spare their lives and homes. On the 31st of March, Mola's threat was put into action and the fighting began in Durango. Condor Legion persuaded Franco to send troops to go north and to be led by General Emilio Mola. The 31st of March 1937, Mola attacked Vizcaya province, as well as bombing Durango by the Condor Legion. Republicans put up a tough fight against the German troops, but eventually were forced back. Many refugees traveled to Guernica for safety. About 1,000 people turned to Guernica. On the 25th of April, Mola sent a warning to Franco saying that he was planning a heavy strike against Guernica. Resistance against this attack was useless. To all Basques, they should surrender and their lives may be spared. To meet these objectives, 2 Heinkel He-111s, 1 Dornado 17, 18 Ju-52 Behelfsbomber, and 3 Italian EDM-79s were assigned for the mission. These were armed with 250 kg medium-high explosive bombs. 50 kilograms light explosive bombs and 1 kilogram incendiaries. The ordnance load for the 24 bombers was 22 tons in total. A follow-up to the bombing raid was also planned for the next day, involving Messerschmitt Bf 109 raids in the area. The order was noted on the 26th of April by Richthofen as starting at once. 88 and J-88 for free fighter bomber mission on the streets near Marquina Guernica Guricias. K-88, VB-88 and Italians for the streets and the bridge east of Guernica. There we have to close the traffic, if we finally want a decision against personnel and materiel of the enemy. Viggen agrees to move his troops for blocking all streets south of Guernica. If this succeeds, we will have trapped the enemy around Marquina. First 5 waves of raid. The first wave arrived over Guernica around 1630. At dawn Du-17, coming from the south, dropped approximately 12 50 kilograms bombs. The 3 Italian M79s had taken off from Soria at 1530 with orders to bomb the road and bridge to the east of Guernica, in order to block the enemy retreat during the second wave. Their orders explicitly stated not to bomb the town itself. During a single 60-second pass over the town, from north to south, the M79s dropped 36 50 kilograms light explosive bombs. Vidal says that at this point, the damage to the town was relatively limited, confined to a few buildings, including the Church of San Juan and headquarters of the Izquierda Republicana political party. The next 3 waves of the first attack then occurred, ending around 1800. The third wave consisted of a Heinkel He-111 escorted by 5 Aviazione Legionaria Fiat fighters led by Capitano Corrado Ricci. The fourth and fifth waves were carried out by German twin-engined planes. Vidal notes, if the aerial attacks had stopped at that moment, for a town that until then had maintained its distance from the convulsions of war, it would have been a totally disproportionate and insufferable punishment. However, the biggest operation was yet to come. Subsequent raids earlier, around noon that day, the Junkers Ju-52s of the Condor Legion had carried out a mission around Guernica. Following this, they landed to rearm and then took off to completed the raid on Guernica. The attack would run from north to south, coming from the Bay of Biscay and up the course of the Erde Bay estuary. The 1st and 2nd Squadrons of the Condor Legion took off at about 1630, with the 3rd Squadron taking off from Burgos a few minutes later. They were escorted from Vitoria-Gasteiz by a squadron of Fiat fighters and Messerschmitt Bf 109Bs of Gunther Lutzow's 2. Staffel of Jagdgruppe 88, for a total of 29 planes. Lutzow himself did not participate in the attack. He was on home leave from 8 to 29 April 1937. From 1830 to 1845, each of the 3 bomber squadrons attacked in a formation of 3 Ju-52s abreast, an attack front of about 150 meters. At the same time, and continuing for around 15 minutes after the bombing wave, the Bf 109Bs and Heinkel He-51 biplanes strafed the roads leading out of town, adding to civilian casualties. Outcome: the bombing shattered the city's defenders' will to resist, allowing the rebel nationalists to overrun it. This indirectly supported Ure's theory, which expected this result. The rebels faced little resistance and took complete control of the town by the 29th of April. The attacks destroyed the majority of Guernica. 3/4 of the city's buildings were reported completely destroyed, and most others sustained damage. Among infrastructure spared were the arms factories Unceta and Company and Talas de Guernica, along with the assembly house Casa de Juntis and the Guernica Coabula. Since the Luftwaffe was then operating on Weber's theory of bombing as a military action, the mission was considered a failure as a result. However, the rubble and chaos that the raid created severely restricted the movement of Republican forces. Since his appointment on the Northern Front, the Soviet aviation advisor Arjen Ukina had insistently called for air reinforcements. motivating his demands by high losses inflicted by nationalist aviation over Republican troops as well as civilian population. On 9 May I-15 and 6 RZET were sent by air from central Spain through Toulouse, in France. Planes were immediately immobilized by non-intervention committee, and later sent back unarmed to central Spain. Casualties. Until recently, the number of civilian casualties has been debated. However, it has now been concluded that between 170 and 300 people were killed in the bombing. Until the 1980s, it had been generally accepted that the number of deaths had been over 1,700. But these numbers are now known to have been exaggerated. Historians now agree that the number of deaths were under 300. An early study by Guernica Zara Historia Taldi estimated the number of victims to be 126, later revised to 153, and is still considered by the organization to be provisional. Those incomplete data roughly correspond to the mortuary records of the town that survived, and do not include the 592 deaths registered in the Bilbao's hospital. Raúl Arias Ramos in his book La Legión Condor en la Guerra Civil states that there were 250 dead. The study by Joan Villaroya and J.M. Sol y Sabat in their book España en Llamas, La Guerra Civil des DLS states that there were 300 dead. These studies, cited by historians such as Stanley Payne and Anthony Beaver as well as media such as the BBC and El Mundo, provide the currently recognized death toll in those numbers. After nationalist forces led by General Emilio Mola's forces took the town 3 days later, the nationalist side claimed that no effort to establish an accurate number have been made by the opposite side. The Basque government, in the confused aftermath of the raids, reported 1,654 dead and 889 wounded. It roughly agrees with the testimony of British journalist George Steer, correspondent of The Times, which estimated that 800 to 3,000 of 5,000 people perished in Guernica. These figures were adopted over the years by some commentators. These figures are represented in a majority of the literature from that period and up to the 1970s. The nationalist junta gave a patently false description of the events and seemed to have made no effort to establish an accurate number. At an extreme low, the François newspaper Ariba claimed, on the 30th of January 1970, that there had only been 12 deaths. Russian archives, through the historian Sergei Abrosov, mention 800 dead as of the 1st of May 1937. This is an incomplete figure and does not take into account either the people later found under the rubble, nor those who died later of their injuries. The Soviets maintained a strategic air force consisting mainly of heavy bombers Tupolev DB-1, R-6, and TB-3, whose general condition was good but that were becoming obsolete. The whole cost them dearly, especially since their replacement by the Tupolev Ant-42 was planned. The validity of the doctrine of Duhet was therefore constantly discussed in the VVSR-KKA headquarters. Consequently, the interest of Soviet military advisors present in Spain was the collection of reliable data for internal use and the devastating effects of the bombing, mass scale, not for controversy. The advisor Ianukina, who was responsible for Northern Front air defense area, had no personal interest in inflating losses at Guernica. Bombs to casualty ratio issues with the originally released figures were raised following an appraisal of large-scale bombing raids during the Second World War. A comparison of the Guernica figures with the figures of dead resulting from air attacks on major European cities during the Second World War exposed an anomaly. James Coram uses the figure of 40 tons of bombs dropped on Guernica, and calculates that if the figure of 1654 dead is accepted as accurate, then the raid caused 41 fatalities per ton of bombs. By way of comparison, the Dresden air raid during February 1945, which saw 3,431 tons of bombs dropped on the city, caused fewer deaths per ton of bombs. 7.2–10.2 fatalities per ton of bombs dropped. Quorum, who ascribes the discrepancy between the high death toll reported at Guernica and in other cases such as Rotterdam to propaganda, goes on to say that for Guernica, a realistic estimate on the high side of bombing effectiveness would yield a figure of perhaps 300 to 400 fatalities in Guernica. This is certainly a bloody enough event, but reporting that a small town was bombed with a few hundred killed would not have had the same effect as reporting that a city was bombed with almost 1,700 dead.